Welcome to Wisdom for Life, where we sift through philosophy to find practical advice that you can use in your everyday life. Hi, I'm Dan Hayes, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Greg Sadler. Today we're talking about
protests and policing, and the question of who watches the watchman, or to use an earlier formulation of that we see in Plato, remembering back to our intro to philosophy days, who guards the guardians. And this is a major issue right now, as all across our nation we're seeing protests, some of which are being dealt with in, we could say, fair and just ways, and others that are being dealt with by quite a bit of violence on the part of police and provocation and the use of all sorts of tactics and technology that places them at an immense advantage. And, we're going to get into a lot of different issues here, but I think one of the things that we could start by talking about is that, all of this broke out or was catalyzed by the George Floyd killing and the lack of reaction on the part of the city of Minneapolis to it. And for a lot of people, it wasn't the last straw, but a catalyst is something that in chemical terms brings things out of a solution that they're in, so that they can precipitate out. There's always got to be something in the background, and at this point there's so much in the background of what's going on that it's brought out hundreds of thousands of people across the nation in a time of pandemic. So people are putting their own lives at risk, and what is the one central issue that a lot of this revolves around? Police aggression and brutality, particularly against members of the African American community. And what we've seen on the side of the police, some people have kind of made this into a joke, but it's not something really to laugh about, is that the police are, in many cases, using exactly the sorts of things that were being protested against to try to break the protests. So this really is a question of who watches the watchman, who guards the guardians. And this goes all the way back to Plato and the Republic, right? And the idea was that you need some people who are particularly courageous or spirited to be the police, to be the military, to be the protectors of everyone. And you think about what police are supposed to be doing. The motto is protect and serve. Protect, right? And so that is what allows them to have the authority that they're given, and the discretion and the capacity to use deadly violence. The fact that they're supposed to be protecting, that is the end, that is the purpose, that is the primary reason to have police. It's not all the other things to make sure that windows don't get broken. It's to protect people. And when police become predatory, and they're no longer protecting, but instead attacking their flock. Plato saw this as a problem all the way back in that time. He said they're like dogs that, attack the sheep. And that has, something has to be done about that. What were you going to say, Dan?
It's with George Floyd, it's just the whole idea of the catalyst, and you see this over and over and over, and every time we have a incident where people this is going too far, there's always oh well, he did this, or it was in the situation or in the moment. But I wanted to say one of the things that helps make this a catalyst was that it was 8.5 minutes of him slowly murdering this person, and it's so unable for anyone to say that action was not justified. That
it was unjustified.
Yeah, it was absolutely. There's no way that you could make an argument that it was justified.
Yeah, and there've been a lot of dodges. The medical examiner trying to say, pre-existing conditions. And my response to that when people were posting that was, well, that's why nobody should kneel on anybody's neck for any amount of time, because who knows who has pre-existing conditions. You don't take risks like that if you're doing it. And then, adding to it the fact that it was being video recorded and the cops didn't care. They were perfectly fine with people watching them kill somebody and the other 3 cops keeping people at bay, which tells you that there's more to the story, right? It tells you that they think they can act with complete impunity and that they're going to be protected. And in today's America, largely because of legislation to absolve police departments from blame and poor leadership.
Supreme Court decisions.
We have allowed there to be set up a situation in which the police largely are not accountable.
Qualified immunity.
Exactly, yeah.
And I can't, for the life of me, I can't think of the name of the particular case at the moment, but the one that set the precedent that on any instant in which a police officer has the feeling that they might have bodily damage to them, they can use deadly force. And it can be an instant, it can be like, a nanosecond, and that will give them cover to do whatever.
Yeah, and this is something, I think this might be a topic for us to explore at another time, and I've been thinking a lot about this. The notion that police officers are supposed to be courageous, if we think about the classic thing. So the idea that they can say, oh, I was in fear of my life when they were heavily armed and oftentimes had all sorts of advantages over whoever it was that they were going to be contending with or bringing force to bear on, to me just seems like an outright lie. And, it's bad enough that there's killing, right? Unjust killing. The lying about it, the cover-up, makes it far worse because it denies justice to the victims, and not just to the victims themselves, but to their families and to the community, to everybody who says, that could be me. You see so many young especially African-American, but not just them, men saying, wow, I could be in that person's place, and if there wasn't a camera trained on me, nobody would even know. I mean, it wouldn't save my life, but nobody would even know that the story is recorded by the police after the fact, after they get their stories straight, would be taken as the real one. And you look back at American history. I mean, again, it's we're enabled by the fact that people have felt that what they were doing was somehow okay. They'd actually write down about, say, lynchings that they did. Now we know that's wrong. And the police know it's wrong too, but they do it, and they get away with it so often. And so this was catalyzing. There's so many people, I think, not just within the particularly affected communities, but all over the place, who are like, this is too much. This is the time when it's gone too far. And then when they started expressing that, and other people started pushing back, what could have happened quite easily would be people push back, and then everyone was like, oh, yeah, you're right. Maybe we won't take a stand on this one. Or it could have been just like one day of protests in Minneapolis and a few echoes around. But instead what we have is what seems to be a growing movement.
Right. And that sustained movement is the thing that is going to actually cause eventual change. And it's really interesting.
I hope.
To the point, right.
Yeah.
It's really interesting to the point where when we all got cameras on our cell phones, on our persons all the time, the rate at which we have UFO sightings has dropped precipitously, and the rate that police have been acting in negative ways towards the populace has gone way up.
That's interesting. Yeah.
What could have caused that?
And it's not just having the capacity to record. I mean, you think back to the L.A.
Rodney
riots.
King.
Yeah. And the fact that there was a guy who had a video camera, because otherwise nobody would have believed Rodney King, And it's not just that we have the capacity to record, which also works against us. The cops are going to be scouring all the protester videos and things like that for faces to try to bring them in on things. So it's not a pure on the side of the people sort of thing. But the fact that we have social networks is incredibly important as well, because these videos then get onto Twitter and Facebook. They even make it onto the old school cable news stuff, although the cable news at this point in time seems to be doing there's both sides to the story sort of thing. It's also
false equivalence.
Yeah, it's very good. Yeah, and we should talk about that in just a moment, that false equivalence, because it is a fallacy, right? Mm-hmm. And not only is it a fallacy in the sense of being something that goes against truth, it's also unjust to engage in. But one of the things I wanted to say very quickly before that is there's a generational gap between those who get most of their news from newspaper websites and cable news, where it's this, both sides are doing things. We really need to be balanced with this. And the younger generations, which are getting it largely from social media and from opinion sites like, say, Vox or Slate or Atlantic, where they're seeing almost in real time. If you're on Twitter, it's almost in real time now, what's happening in cities across the states, and you get to see the people posting raw video of police, say, not just attacking protesters, but attacking clergy and attacking press people and attacking medical personnel, really going over the line.
And the supercuts therein, those are becoming like, oh, it's not like this litany of things, but we can actually put this to, some side of a progression. And
yeah,
I don't know, I guess some music, let's turn into a little bit of entertainment, but also it still pulls forth. It's like these things happen over and over and over, that you see them.
Yeah.
And it's overwhelming.
So let's talk about this false equivalence thing for just a moment. We usually label this as a fallacy, right? So what does that mean?
A fallacy is an argument that does not always bring you to the truth of the matter. It's like the conclusion that you get from a fallacious argument may or may not be true, but there's no way that you can know it's true from the argument itself.
Yeah, so that's important in the realm of truth. What's wrong with using fallacies? I mean, especially if the other side is using fallacies. Is there something bad about that? I mean, I think there is.
I guess if you want to be an honest interlocutor, if you're just trying to be a sophist and you're just trying to convince people based on no truth, then yeah, fallacies are great. But if you actually want to get to the truth of the matter, the core of the issue, then you've got to avoid them at all costs.
I suppose we could actually say that in many cases, fallacies are what allow groups that don't want to be in touch with the truth, that want to deny reality, they allow them to have a group cohesiveness through having a shared story. Right?
Yeah, didn't we talk about that with last week about lies, blue lies, or shared lies.
Let's remind people what that is. So as opposed to white lies to like save face or preserve somebody else's feelings or accomplish some sort of good task, and opposed to black lies where you're just trying to hurt people, period. Blue lies are
for yourself.
Yeah, blue lies are somewhere in between. And that's when you're protecting your group. You're telling a lie that furthers the interests of your group, but probably damages the interests of another group. So, and this leads to something that you had wanted to talk about earlier before we got onto this, about why are people denying what's happening? Right?
Yeah.
What are the motives for that people have?
I could definitely see that in the context of blue lies. That you see this within, I guess, certain religions have this. They put a statement of faith, and it might be something that could be potentially easily
refutable,
disproven in a different but because I say it's true, and that is me, I guess, to a certain extent, signaling to everyone else in the group that I am part of the group. Because we all believe the same thing that no one else believes, and
and
that actually increases the cohesiveness of the group.
Yeah, and the same dynamic can happen in terms of political organizations or social classes or it can happen in terms of sports teams. You see some of the crazy things people have to say about rival sports teams.
Right.
Usually not with such horrible effects. Depends on how bad the fan base is,
Right.
Compare, say, Packers fans versus Eagles fans.
Right.
Eagles fans are kind of dangerous. So
there's certain soccer hooligans.
Yeah. I was just thinking, this is totally off topic, but we were at Lambeau. I was at Lambeau for the very first time this last year, and it was a Packers versus Bears game. And so these are, big rivals, right? And because Chicago is close enough to Milwaukee, they can easily drive up. And I would say that 2/3 of the people in the stands were Packers fans, and I would say that the other third were Bears fans, or people who just weren't wearing anything. You couldn't tell who they were for. And I didn't see any Packers fans treat Bears fans badly. Now that's unusual. I think in quite a few places that you go and you're wearing the other team's thing. I mentioned Philly, great example. They will abuse you. And some of that has to do with this sort of in-group cohesion that we were just talking about. And it can be quite bad. And it can lead us to ignoring injustices that if we get away from the silliness of sports and talk about like generations of injustice towards minorities here in Milwaukee, it's a prime example. We're still one of the most segregated large cities in the United States, even though you live in one area, Riverwest, which is pretty desegregated, and I live here in the downtown, which is desegregated. If you're just looking at those areas, you wouldn't notice what the rest of the city looks like, right?
Right.
And there's historical reasons for that,
redlining and.
Yeah, and the police have played a role in that as well. So we should jump into
talk about peace at the moment. Let's talk about negative peace and positive peace.
Okay.
And so I was reading a little bit from, I guess, the whole thing, MLK's letter from the Birmingham jail, and this passage really is very impactful. I've been greatly disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride towards freedom is not the white citizen counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you, but you in the goal you seek, but I can't agree with your methods or of direct action. Who feels that he can set the timetable for another's freedom, who lives by the myth of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait until a more convenient season.
Yeah. Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail is a really important piece to read. There's been a lot of discussion of Martin Luther King in the last couple of days in light of the George Floyd thing, because a lot of people have said, he's the person who all of the what he's calling white moderates, and nowadays we call them liberals, will bring up and say, we got to make sure that everything remains totally nonviolent. And it's true that Martin Luther King was an advocate of nonviolent direct action after, by the way, having been an advocate of armed self-defense. He changed his mind, and he changed his mind in a robust and rigorous way. There was nothing namby-pamby or sort of, let's just all kumbaya, get together and get along sort of stuff with it. He was seriously committed to it. And it's true that white conservatives and white liberals love Martin Luther King because they love to not read Martin Luther King. They love the idea of let's all be nice and get along, and they memorize one or two lines from the I Have a Dream speech. But if you really read the letter from a Birmingham jail, it's an indictment of not only the society of that time, but our cities and small towns and suburbs right now as well. And
just later on in the the letter, he talks about how if you don't work with us as the nonviolent movement, then you're going to force the hand and move these people to those more violent groups that are still going about to the same goals. And he talks about specifically the Brotherhood of Islam and how, or
the Nation of Islam,
Nation of Islam. Thank you. And how they basically have no buy-in. They believe that the current government and society has no place for them, and so they have no problem being violent within it.
Yeah, and you could say that there was, I mean, there was a contrast between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Malcolm X, the phrase everyone associates with him is by any means necessary. There were some strictures that even he thought you had to follow, but the entire Black Power movement that was not devoted to nonviolent direct action looked at what Martin Luther King was doing as essentially giving in. But I think Martin Luther King, and we should always remember all the people that were surrounding him and working with him, were able to accomplish what they did because there was that, well, if you're not going to deal with us, you're going to deal with these guys over here, and they're not going to be as forgiving. The other thing I'll say, too, is, Martin Luther King drew quite a bit on Gandhi, who also had a philosophy of nonviolent activism. And when Gandhi was asked about resisting the British, he said, well, we can appeal to their consciences. And that's the key thing. If you can't appeal to the conscience of those who are engaging in unjust oppression, exploitation, suppression, all these sorts of things, if you're dealing with Attila the Hun, there's no such thing as nonviolent direct action in that case. You have to use violence against them. And so, now this isn't what Martin Luther King is saying, but if you extend that logic further, if there's a side that is going to try to use whatever tricks and whatever lies and whatever force they can use and essentially terrorizing people to further their side, well, maybe then they can't be reasoned with. And it's up to, the people who are at risk of falling into that to pull themselves back from the precipice, I think. If the police forces were really to become just a bunch of armed thugs, then I think we would have a moral duty to all rise up against them, quite frankly. But it's not at that point. It is possible to appeal to people's conscience. And so that makes it imperative to keep making the case over and over again that what we need here is to see justice being done, not a suppression of protest, but actually allowing it to go on, And I think that can be done while still protecting human life and protecting property and all these other things that are indeed important. But the priority here really has to be bringing these festering issues out into the open and allowing people to express what's wrong with police violence directed systematically at minorities over years and years and years,
So this is the negative piece.
Yeah, exactly.
You look at this letter and it's like a scathing polemic, which is, I guess, a scathing rebuke of certain positions. And he talks about like how in Birmingham specifically is like the number one place where people they're on investigated bombings of black homes and churches. And so this negative piece is this false sense of peace that there's not fighting on the streets because one group has so restricted the rights of the other that they won't openly engage. But it doesn't mean that the basis of that problem, has actually gone away. It simmers and seethes right under the surface and is waiting I guess a blister that is wanting to be popped.
And I think going back to talking about the technology, I think in this age of interconnectedness, those sorts of things can't be hidden away as effectively as they were in the past. If you I mean, why do we know about so many police killings? Not only of African American young men. I mean, I even think about that one white guy who was ordered by the cop to lay down, and he did, and the cop started shooting him up anyway. And we
Right.
know about that precisely because we've seen the videos because they're there in social media. And so I think the people who think that they're going to get away with stuff and cover it up, they may not go to jail, but people know about it. Public opinion is able to latch onto it in a way that it wasn't able to in the past.
Right. Like, the reason we're here, we're recording the
Exactly.
cost to entry into getting your voice out is so much lower than it used to be. You used to had to buy a printing press and ink and paper and distribute that stuff. Man, that was a lot of things to do an undertaking. And this is I don't know. How much time did it take us?
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. It's a good thing to be able to encourage those who are going to be pushing for change. And the push for change, it's not going to be done this summer, and it's not going to be over just with the November election. I think this is one of those cases where there is something that's happening now, and there is some forward momentum, but it's going to have to be, I keep coming back to this phrase that I learned from my wife, who keeps using it. Well, I mean, it's almost meta in this way. It's consistent pressure relentlessly applied. I think that's what we're going to have to use. It's not going to be like narratives where we were talking about Star Wars earlier, where we blow up the Death Star and now we have the everyone gets a medal and we're good until the next movie. It's going to be little steps here and there, consolidating gains. And another thing that this is going to take, we're getting actually quite away from some of the points we want to talk about, but I think this is quite important. Change is not going to happen without buy-in, ultimately, also from the people who were trying to change. In this case, the police. So we're going to have to find ways to get rid of a lot of bad cops. And by get rid of, I mean get them fired, get them out of being police, and not in the sense where they get fired in one department and go 3 suburbs down and get hired at another one. There's going to have to be a lot of screening and a lot of holding leadership accountable and all of that. But if we want there to be good policing, we're going to have to. We're not going to just be able to say, all cops are bastards or anything like that. That's not going to be. That may be a nice thing to say when we're, riling people up. Actually, my son said that earlier today to me on the phone in a discussion. But we don't want them all to be bastards. We want them ultimately to be protectors. And there may be some things in the nature of policing that are rather corrosive, and we have to target those. We have to make police actually care about ethics and accountability. And that's going to be a tough thing to do, so we're going to have to push and push and push and push and push.
So
and
this
whole
thing kind of... Oh.
Well, I think some people are going to run out of steam, inevitably. Right? And that means that other people are going to have to step up at that point and carry on the thing. But I think what we're seeing here now really is a historical turning point.
And so this really makes me think of, we're going to jump around a little bit here.
Yeah.
But down to the 3.5% rule.
Yeah, talk about that.
So this is Erica Chenoweth and Maria J. Steffen, who are both PhDs, and they have been working on different aspects of what causes either revolutions or just political change. Mm-hmm. And they did a meta-analysis. I don't know if it's meta-analysis. It's analysis of historical events from 1900 up to 2006, and they found that if you can get 3.5% of the population to join an active and sustained protest, it succeeds. Every single protest that is either violent or not, that gets 3.5% of the population to buy in and actually participate, either results in the government adopting the positions of the protesters, or disintegrates the country. And so you got to see that in like Egypt and Tunisia, where during the
what if you have counter movements where like you've got your 3.5, but then there's another 3.5 on the other side, and they're pushing back on the same stuff.
I know. She doesn't go quite into it, but it makes me think of I guess Egypt again, where there was the Arab Spring thing, and then there was also the Muslim Brotherhood that was also pushing, and they were I guess both pushing for the ouster of I believe it was Mubarak at the moment. But there was definitely the Muslim Brotherhood group and the other group, and their ends weren't the same, even though the means to get to their ends were the same, and so they worked together at one point.
Yeah, they had very different visions of what Egypt should look like after the military dictatorship was gone.
And so this the whole idea of like being sustained and constantly pushing, and if you get a large enough portion of the population to join you, then you can push it over the top. The problem is that violent campaigns are only attract about a fourth on average of the people that nonviolent ones do, and so you actually have if you can sustain a nonviolent campaign, it's actually one of the ways that you can get enough people to actually join you, and that idea is one of the reasons why people that oppose particular protests are so happy to try to paint the protesters in any way as violent.
You know, one of the things that I had wanted to bring up is, and again, I'll use my kid as a example. He was talking about, we should riot. And I said, you want to avoid that word, that plays exactly into the hands of those who want to see an end to the protests and everyone to just shut up and get back to work. Protest is what's happening. And protest is something that is not, Americans love to appeal to the Constitution, but this is something that is acknowledged as a moral right basically in every functioning democracy. That's what makes it a democracy, the fact that you can protest, not just that we have voting and things like that, but that you can actually express yourself within organized civil society in ongoing ways, and so
redress of grievances.
Yeah, exactly. If we can protest like companies changing the formula of their potato chips, which people do, they get on Twitter and rail about it. Well, it's all the more important that we be able to protest about things that really do matter, our politics and the nature of our society and how we distribute justice and who the policing falls upon and who goes to jail and who doesn't. So I think, when we're thinking about what's going on the side, let's call them the side across from the police, because the police are lined up in lines, generally not engaged in dialogue or anything like that. They're lined up facing a group of people. So the group of people consists largely of protesters, and that's what they are, and they are nonviolent. And then we have some people who are there to riot, and this usually in Milwaukee is happening after curfew. Some of them are there to break windows and loot things, but they are a tiny minority. They are by far not what the movement at present is about. And then we have some other instigators that are there to stir up stuff for other reasons. It's not just selfish. It's because they've got some sort of ideological beef, and some of them are from the far right. Some of them are from the far left. And again, very small minorities. The vast majority in each of the places that I've actually been able to see, and I've looked at a lot what's going on in a lot of these American city protests, are people who are engaging in essentially nonviolent direct action.
Yeah, the vast majority of them see that. And, I would actually add one more group, which has got a unfortunate long history in the United States and all over the world, are, counterintelligence programs.
Infiltrators,
agent provocateurs. And, if if you're not familiar with it, you should probably become familiar with Continental Pro, which was a program that ran through from 1956 to 71
Yeah.
in the FBI under our best friend J. Edgar Hoover, in order to basically try to stamp out the quote unquote subversives, and basically it was just a campaign to either discredit from the outside, to try to pull up dirt of leaders, to create dirt, to infiltrate and cause disorder and discord within the groups, to infiltrate into protests, to either start violence themselves or to instigate violence in others,
Yeah.
and all the way up to assassinations of leadership within these groups.
Yeah. And it wasn't just in America too. The Brits had their own intelligence people doing that with their own leftist movements, and I think this is kind of a common thing. So a little bit off topic here, but if you think about the resources that are devoted to carrying out that sort of infiltration, it's not something that you can do on the cheap. And that money has to come from somewhere. And where is it coming from? It's coming from the taxpayers. It's coming from the people who are, the ones who are upset about things. And we can say the same thing about the police. One of the issues with the Minneapolis Police Department is that it's so well funded. Forbes did an article a while back, and they looked at all these big metropolitan police forces. Minneapolis was spending over 30% of their budget on policing. That's an awful lot that's not being devoted to schools, to public health, to all the other things that we really need. Instead, they're given all this money, and then they buy riot gear with it, and they pay for lawsuits and all these other things to essentially create their police as a protected class. Another thing that we could probably go on and on about this all day, but another big problem with police, and this is a problem here in Milwaukee, is that they don't have to reside in the places that they're policing.
Right.
I don't know if you remember that movie Copland. It's a very interesting. It kind of went under the radar. It didn't get a lot of accolades as far as I remember, but it was quite good. It was about New York City, and it was about this small suburb town where all these cops lived who actually worked in the city, and they would get around the housing things by having like in a little apartment in the city that they could claim residency in, but they actually lived outside of the city so that they could do their own thing. And the local sheriff uncovered corruption, and then he was pressured not to do anything about it. The sheriff is played by Sylvester Stallone. Not a great actor. So, obviously, it's not going to get a lot of accolades for that. But the basic idea was if you're not actually in the community that you're serving, it's going to be harder to identify with the people in the community and to care about them, and not just to see it as us versus them, as being an occupying force, which is part of what's happening right now. I think we have a similar problem too when we call out the National Guard. These National Guards people, they don't have a stake in Milwaukee unless they're from Milwaukee,
Right. And if you're not part of the group, then you're I don't know, it kind of makes me think of the ancient Spartans, and they who are the
thank God things aren't that bad.
Yeah, but just like
No,
they always saw themselves as an occupying force there, because they were they were an occupying force technically.
That's quite true.
What was the
Helots?
The other Helots, yeah.
Yeah, so the Spartans were essentially an invading people who superimposed their rule on a much broader population who they enslaved and maintained in slavery that entire time. Every once in a while they'd revolt, and then they'd be put down with really bloody reprisals. And they were, the part of the Spartan ethos was to be predatory on these people. It's interesting that when you bring up the Spartans, Aristotle in the Politics talks about the Spartans. And as opposed to, like, say, Socrates and Plato, who kind of admired them to some degree, but also thought they were corrupt, Aristotle thought that the Spartans were really misguided. That they had they were sort of like an animal. He didn't use this metaphor, but they're sort of like an animal that had bred itself for one purpose and got really good at that purpose and became really crappy at everything else. So Aristotle talks about them as, being really great soldiers and preparing for war. And up until that time, the Spartans really hadn't been beaten in battle by anybody, although later on the Thebes would beat them. The sacred band would destroy the Spartan record in that respect. And Aristotle said, well, that's great. You're great at fighting. You're terrible at everything else, because you made that the center of your existence, this struggle for dominance and honor. Think about the way that Trump was talking just the other day. You have to dominate, he's telling the state governors. Well, that's foolish talk. You don't dominate a free people that you actually care about and value. That's the way that a oppressor talks. That's not the way somebody who wants to get people to buy in and think that we live in a society together talks.
Yeah, the Spartans sound like several hundred years of negative peace.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, and they and when everybody around you has that mindset, you don't know any better. That's the best you can hope for. So negative peace, right? What's positive peace look like?
A positive peace is a true and lasting and sustainable peace built on harmony and justice and equity for all people.
So here's a question. Is that something that you can attain once and for all?
No, you have to keep on working for that, because that thing is, always crumbling.
Yeah. So the people who always, we addressed your problems. We gave you some handouts or however they want to frame it. Why can't you just be happy and, not protest? They're not for a positive peace then. They're for a negative peace, right?
Right.
I think part of what would be required, and so I'm going to bring in another philosopher who's still alive right now, Jürgen Habermas, one of the key thinkers of discourse ethics. And I know one of the things you want to talk about is the social contract. So Habermas talks about something like this. We have you could say, buy-in that has to happen. We have to figure out what kind of society we're going to have. And it's something that we have to continually reevaluate and continually remake. And we do that by talking with each other. And by the way, I my mentor actually sat down with Habermas at a conference and did precisely this. The sort of haves and the have-nots at this philosophy conference split up into two groups, and were not physically, but rhetorically at each other's throats. Habermas actually called like a meeting of everybody and sat down and put some, drinks on the table and said, okay, we're going to hash this out. And what you do is you treat your interlocutors as somebody who actually has something to say, has something to contribute. They're not just an enemy across the table. They're somebody that you can deal with. And you work out norms that can be acceptable to everybody. And you don't stop until you can get at least some consensus, some buy-in. And the only way to do that is to take risks, to be willing to say, okay, we were wrong in doing this. We apologize. What would it take to make this right? And that takes a lot of courage on the part of those who have benefited and exploited and, made
especially for those people that see that saying that they're wrong is a mark of weakness.
That's a big problem, right? Yeah. I guess some people just will never admit that they're wrong. And then others, they worry that if they, the proverbial give an inch, they'll take a mile. If I say that I'm wrong and I apologize for this, then they'll talk about the other 20 things I didn't apologize for,
Yeah. So I would like you to go into a little bit on the higher law.
Oh, that Martin Luther King talks about in the letter from a Birmingham jail, right?
And how that intersects with Cicero and Augustine and Aquinas.
Yeah, so it's in the Western traditions, it goes all the way back to Cicero, the Stoics, and also to Aristotle. Aristotle talks about something like this. And even Sophocles has Antigone talk about a higher law that supersedes that of the city. So this is a long-standing concept. And you can also find a similar thing in Indian philosophy and Chinese philosophy. I think it's something that's kind of a constant. This notion that whatever laws we currently have in place and whatever rulers, whatever we're going to call them, the executive, the magistrate, the people who make the decisions on the spot and then the people who direct them, none of them get to say that, like Judge Dredd, I am the law, right? They're all accountable to something higher. So they're measured by it. And, this could come from different sources. Cicero thought that it was sort of built into the fabric of nature as part of what's inherent in rationality. Thomas Aquinas thought it came from God ultimately. The natural law is a reflection of the eternal law. Augustine talks about this, but they all agree in this, that if a law is going to be, if a human law, a practice, a norm, an executive order is going to be just, it cannot be out of sync with the higher moral law. If it is, it loses its legitimacy. So, for example, using the military to attack protesters, that goes against the moral law. If they, and you can say, well, what if those protesters were themselves armed, like the ones who were storming state houses earlier, and they were firing at them? Well, they're not protesters at that point. Now there's something different. Now they are armed belligerents, and you can use force against them. Insofar as they remain protesters, you can't use deadly force against them or potentially deadly force. That is a violation of the moral law, and those who engage in it and those who command it should be held to standards. As we see, for example, a little bit of breaking news. By the time that this is actually playing, it's been several days, but a little bit of breaking news is that former Defense Secretary Mattis unequivocally condemned President Trump's use of troops to clear out the Capitol so he could have his photo ops. And he's not mincing any words in saying that there was an abuse of executive authority in Lafayette Square. Now, I think what he's doing there is he's referring to the same moral law, higher law, that, say, Martin Luther King would have been referring to.
Yeah, MLK's got a couple quotes here on unjust laws. Unjust law is a code that the majority inflicts on a minority that is not binding on itself, and a just law is a code that a majority compels a minority to follow, and that is willing to follow itself.
That's a key
sameness
aspect.
Made legal.
Living up to the very standards that you're attempting to impose on somebody else, that is of the essence of being a moral person. Bad people make excuses for themselves and impose what they can't themselves do on other people. And another thing to keep in mind too with Martin Luther King that I think is particularly important in our time, he said that law could be unjust as the law itself. So like if I have a law that requires me, for example, to go next door and beat up my neighbor or else I'm going to be fined, okay, that's an unjust law, right? That needs to go. But a law can also be unjust in its application, and this is where policing comes in. If a law is on its face just, but it's imposed unfairly on some people and then it's not applied to others, that makes the law unjust. So if, let's take the example of protesters, right? So the police did nothing, absolutely nothing, when we had people breaking the law when it came to COVID, going around without masks, saying that they wouldn't do that, sometimes spitting on police, not observing social distancing, and carrying weapons around that there's no reason they should have in any civilized society, regardless of what amendments there are. People were carrying those around just to terrorize. That was the reason for it. They should have all been arrested and thrown in jail and disarmed and charged with all sorts of things. None of them were. Not a single one. And now, because people want to protest police brutality, suddenly it's okay to use, tear gas grenades and shoot rubber bullets, which aren't actually rubber, at people, and to attack the press and attack medical personnel. So that's a clear, example of a law that's unjust in its application.
Another one is, there's a study by the ACLU that went from 2001 to 2010 and looked at the arrest and conviction rate of black and white individuals for marijuana possession, specifically from 18 to 25-year-olds, in which about 25 to 30% of both black and white, actually whites have more usage than blacks in this particular study, so basically negligible difference in the actual usage, but the black youth, I guess not youth, but whatever, 18 or 25, young people were four times more likely. Yeah. Are 4 times more likely to be arrested and 7 to 8% more likely to be convicted, and that is definitely an incongruity in the application of the law.
Yeah, and I mean, we can come up with all sorts of examples. The drug application of drug laws is a great example. Sentencing is another prime example. The whole stop and frisk thing that was finally brought up in a useful way in the Democratic debates clearly applied much more heavily to minority communities than to the white community, and so. Those are some of the things that create underlying, I don't even want to say resentments, because resentments almost implies as if there isn't a good reason to be upset about these things. These are things that people ought to be legitimately upset about. And those of us who are not particularly impacted about it, we should be indignant. That's an emotion that I think we ought to feel. We shouldn't be like, oh, well, I'm glad it doesn't, affect me, lucky where I ended up in society. Instead, we should be like, well, this is nonsense that we're using our resources to police these people and not these people. We're distributing harms over here and distributing all the nice benefits over here. That should bother us, I think. Now, this is a great place for us to talk a little bit about, well, how should we get bothered? You and I are both co-leaders of the Milwaukee Stoic Fellowship. Somebody might say, well, that's not very stoic of you to say that you should get bothered. I think that it's perfectly fine to feel an emotion of righteous indignation. You don't use that as your sole guidance or fuel.
Or your motivation.
Yeah, and you don't want to stay upset all the time, but like Seneca says, anything that you can accomplish with anger, you can accomplish with reason. You can stick with it. There's this view that as rational beings who have a common social nature and care about each other, we can be emotionally involved and rational at the same time and sort of stick with what we need to do.
And you can't fall into that, indifference trap that just because you don't have the direct control over the situation and the outcomes that you shouldn't act. You're compelled to act regardless because you are, working for the betterment of the polis, the cosmopolitan, the entire political group or
the
people
whole,
of the
right?
world. Yeah.
There's that, and then there's also another resource I think there is in Stoicism is, Epictetus says that our duties, our obligations, are revealed to us by the names that we bear, the ways in which we describe ourselves. So if I describe myself as a fellow citizen of the United States or fellow resident of Wisconsin or fellow resident of Milwaukee, and I see my fellow residents being oppressed by the police for talking about how the police have been oppressing people, I have a duty to those people, because they're members of my community, to stick up for them, to care about them.
And so, to be very direct, we are saying a practice that you can do is to go to the protest yourself. One, to support the cause, but also if you are fearful of what it is to be in a protest, if you don't know, if you have this misunderstanding of what they are doing, going there and being in the thick of it will really remove that fear, erode that fear that you might have had beforehand. Yeah. Especially if you go like during the daytime, if it's
don't go noon, at like 2:00 in the morning.
Right. Was the whole adage like nothing good happens after 2 a.m.?
Yeah, that's true. I think that some people who would be leery of doing that would say, well, I don't want to be like advocating what they're doing. I don't want to be mistaken for being one of the protesters. Do you think there's a risk of that?
I think there's a really small risk, or maybe find a protest that you find a little bit more benign if this one for some reason is not your cup of tea. But like just to experience the event of getting together and saying we think there's something wrong with our society at the moment, and we are going to make our voices known that we don't enjoy that. And one of these things here is this idea of courage, and courage being synonymous with some sort of violence. And I would like to try to
being a tough guy
that.
Is courageous, right?
Yeah. Because nonviolent action is courageous because it gets results. If we looked at earlier, the 3.5% rule here, it doesn't need to be violent. It can be nonviolent, and it can cause massive systematic change.
It takes more courage not to just swing at people, I think, in a lot of cases. What about people who
someone just provoked me?
What about people who can't effectively go out and protest, like those who already are sick or are at risk of, let's say they have compromised immune systems, or they're living with people who that could be a problem with? What can they do?
So there's a number of things you can either support them by like giving them monetary support, or like material support, food, water, whatnot. You can try to share the message online. We have that ability nowadays rather easily. There are distributed tactics, like in Iran, where they would, like, every night at a certain time would get out and they'd yell and bang pots on their roofs because they were being militarily shut down, and so they kept the protests going, even in face of violence, by distributing the protest.
Yeah, well, those all sound like good things to do. And what if somebody is not quite sure where they fit in right now with the whole situation? I think there are some people who are kind of fence sitting. What would you say to them?
I think this is the time to read as much as you possibly can,
and come to a decision then, right?
Right, because you have to come to a decision at some point in time. You really shouldn't be fence sitting on this one. Okay, well, any final thoughts to lead us out on? So I've got a little quote from Captain Adama of the Battlestar Galactica. There's a reason that you separate the military and the police. One fights the enemy of the state, and the other one serves to protect the people. When the military becomes both, then the enemies of the state tend to become the people. So say we all.